Last night, as you know, President Trump unveiled what was billed as a new approach to Afghanistan. The plan continues America's engagement, provided few details, including any specific reference to how many additional American troops are going to be deployed there. The 30-minute speech marked a major policy reversal for Donald Trump, who in the past has urged the United States to get out of Afghanistan.
My original instinct was to pull out. And historically, I like following my instincts. But all my life, I've heard that decisions are much different when you sit behind the desk in the Oval Office. In other words, when you're President of the United States. A core pillar of our new strategy is a shift from a time-based approach to one based on conditions. I've said it many times, how counterproductive it is for the United States to announce in advance the dates we intend to begin or end military options. We will not talk about numbers of troops or our plans for further military activities. We are a partner and a friend, but we will not dictate to the Afghan people how to live or how to govern their own complex society. We are not nation building again. We are killing terrorists. We can no longer be silent about Pakistan's safe havens for terrorist organizations, the Taliban, and other groups that pose a threat to the region and beyond. It is time for Pakistan to demonstrate its commitment to civilization, order, and to peace. Another critical part of the South Asia strategy for America is to further develop its strategic partnership with India, the world's largest democracy and a key security and economic partner of the United States.
So there's the president last night. David Ignatius, you know, around this set since January 20th, there have been a lot of people who have said, well, we didn't vote for Donald Trump, but we just hoped, at the very least, that the magnitude of the office and the responsibilities would weigh on him enough that he would moderate some of his thinking, some of his views, some of his bad habits. Well, last night, it sounded like at least he admitted that at least in one way, the weight of this office, the responsibilities of the commander-in-chief did get him to change a view, and that is on Afghanistan. When you sit behind that desk and you understand for the first time, we can't win in Afghanistan, but we sure as hell can lose there.
Joe, I think you put it just right. It was a somber speech. It didn't have any of those flourishes of hyperbole, you know, where the president will say, and I really mean it, and you know, it's beautiful too, which I think undercut what he says. This was straightforward, and you had a president who really had wanted to get out of a war he thought didn't make sense, and now, after working with his generals, working with his advisors, he has concluded that it is, even if he doesn't have a plan to win, he said he did, but there are no details of it, and nobody I've talked to sees a plan for something fundamentally different. He does know that walking away, in effect surrendering this commitment that's been going on for 16 years would be a mistake. He needs the platform in Afghanistan to conduct operations there and in Pakistan. I think that's the core of what he's decided to do, although he didn't really state it directly. This is a counterterrorism platform that's too valuable to the U.S. to give up right now. But we're back in the same world of pressuring Pakistan, carrots and sticks for Pakistan. He didn't talk about nation building for Afghanistan, but inevitably, when you're trying to build an army, that's implicit. It was a moment where, as he said himself, the realities of being president caught up with his rhetoric and changed his plans.
And the realities of what we're facing in Afghanistan and what the stakes are in Afghanistan is something that I think our leaders are going to have to be more honest about, David. I remember back in 2004, 2005, asking a special ops guy, said, hey, did Iraq, sending all the troops to Iraq, distract us from our mission in Afghanistan? How badly does that hurt us? And he said, well, if you could take all the troops in Iraq and add another 500,000 and invade Pakistan, then maybe you could get to the root of the problem. He said, but this isn't a war with Afghanistan. This is a war with Afghanistan and Pakistan, and we're never going to be able to fight that war. The best we can do is not lose the war. That was 13 years ago, 12, 13 years ago. It's the same reality. And even though people like me don't like to hear this, and most Americans don't like to hear it, we just may be in a situation like we were in after the Korean War, where leaving is not an option. And people like me thought leaving was an option until I saw what happened when we just left Iraq.
Joe, I think you put your finger on it, and the president made that point, that we've seen what hasty withdrawal does. President Obama was determined to fulfill his campaign pledge to pull the troops out of Iraq, and the result of doing that was to create a vacuum, and into that vacuum came ISIS. We all watched it. We've all learned that same lesson. The president has too. I found myself thinking, watching the president last night, how hard it must have been to talk to General Kelly, who lost a son in Afghanistan, and to try to think how he would tell General Kelly he was going to follow through on his plan to just pull out of there. It doesn't work. It's a wasting money. Could you look General Kelly in the eye and say the sacrifice your son made, the ultimate sacrifice, really did in the end wasn't important enough to keep anything on the ground? I think in the end he decided, no, I'm told there's very little enthusiasm for this policy today in the Pentagon, but a general recognition, not a single person there really can bear the thought of walking away.
No. Mark Halperin, I don't know that the realities on the ground are any different in 2017 than they were in early 2003, let's say. But at the same time, if America leaves, there will be a horrific void. So Donald Trump had a lot of simplistic slogans during the campaign. He said a lot of things that made crowds cheer. There's nothing easy, there's nothing simple, there's nothing pat about our policy in Afghanistan now. What's the takeaway and what's the political impact?
Well, bitter irony that pretty much the hardest thing in a president's inbox for the last three presidents leads to roughly the same conclusion. You can't walk away. You know, there's some new things here, but look at sort of the foundation. Make the Taliban come to the negotiating table. Try to get the Afghan government to be less corrupt. Try to change, as David said, with carrots and sticks, the behavior of Pakistan. Those are the foundations of Barack Obama's attempts to try to deal with Afghanistan.
Well, and also George W. Bush's. I mean, you know.
Yeah. So I mean, do people think the Taliban's going to negotiate in good faith? Do people think Pakistan's behavior is going to change? Do people think the Afghan government can be less corrupt? If you look at the history of the last two presidents, you wouldn't bet on any of those three things happening, and yet those are all part of this president's plan. He said he'd be a candidate of change, including very explicitly on this issue. There's clearly a lot more continuity here than change, and yet, while a lot of the American people may not like it, you look at the reaction from Congress, including from some Democrats, but from a lot of establishment Republicans, they applaud this. And people who are looking at the sort of longer arc of this president's process of being president on tough issues, this was clearly one of the most deliberate processes, the deliberating processes the president has been through. He listened to a lot of voices. He considered a lot of options. But I'll say to conclude, this is a bitter thing for a lot of people who wanted change, because this policy is a lot more continuity than it is change.
Julie Pace, inside the White House, obviously. I mean, we could look at a couple of things here. One is the Bannon effect. Steve Bannon gone, and now actually people that understand military tactics and understand where we are in the world and have actually fought in wars can be in there and have a strong voice. You could take that part of it, but there's also the fact that the president does listen to generals. So here's a president that doesn't even listen to scientists saying don't stare into the sun during a solar eclipse, but it appears that it appears that time spent at Camp David was worth it. If you want even if you disagree with the policy, there was a reasoned, thoughtful process that our national security team walked through.
And even before that big meeting at Camp David last week, this has been one of the most detailed, most thorough processes that we've seen this White House go through. You know, this is the same White House largely that was doing the travel ban and some of these other policies that were rolled out pretty quickly without a lot of thought behind the implementation. You saw a completely different strategy here from the generals, which was really to come to Trump with a detailed plan to make the case to him in a sustained way that really appealed to his own interests. And what we're told about Trump's reaction actually is really fascinating as well, that he was asking questions about how do we win and what is the outcome here. Those are questions that don't have a lot of easy answers when it comes to Afghanistan. This is a war that has seemed unwinnable for 2 presidencies now, but he's taking this on because his generals have told him that the consequences of withdrawing would be disastrous. And look, Trump, we've talked about this before. Trump wants to be a successful president. Whether he can do that or not, I think remains an open question, but he does not want to be a president who creates a vacuum, who allows Afghanistan to turn back into a launching pad for terror attacks in the United States.
Right, and that is, at the end of the day, Josh, any president that faces this faces just a lot of bad options. I mean, President Obama's decision, he struggled over it for so long. I think 2009, tripled the number of, or added 30,000 troops in Afghanistan and just struggled with it. And at some point, doesn't every president understand, despite what they say on the campaign trail, that victory in Afghanistan means there wasn't a terror attack launched against a building in New York or Washington today?
Yeah. When it comes to Afghanistan policy, that is the root of everybody's ideal outcome, is preventing horrific, large-scale terrorist attacks against the United States that are launched from Afghanistan. And President Obama campaigned in 2007 and 2008 as president on decimating core al-Qaeda that was located in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. And based on the strategy that involved a surge of military resources, based on a renewed diplomatic effort, which is key here, and we've not yet talked about in detail this morning and wasn't talked about much last night. That was critical to our success in doing that. But, Joe, the other part of the Afghanistan policy decision that President Obama genuinely struggled with was also at the end of his term, which is this question that he'd set a goal of trying to essentially get our troops out of Afghanistan by the end of his tenure. And he made a decision over the course of 2015 and 2016 that it wouldn't be safe for our country to do that.
Yeah, just can't do it. I mean, you know, Noah, there are a lot of us, I'm not including you, but a lot of conservatives that saw the withdrawal from Iraq as a good thing. Certainly not John McCain, not Lindsey Graham, but, you know, after a decade of war, a lot of us, and I include myself here, said, hey, enough is enough. Are we going to be an occupying force in 2 countries for the next 30 years? And a lot of us learned a valuable lesson after Iraq, that suddenly, you know, I stopped saying when I went out giving speeches, we're spending $2 billion, you know, a week or a month in Afghanistan. Let's spend that money rebuilding America. Well, guess what? Sometimes we don't have easy options, and Donald Trump ran head on into that last night, didn't he?
Yeah, he's not the first. The last 3 consecutive presidents have, to one degree or another, ran on retrenchment. And those 3 presidents encountered realities in the White House that forced them to abandon their campaign trail rhetoric. Look, it's not easy to tell the American people that we are obligated just about everywhere in the world. And I wouldn't call the 8,000 some odd troops that are stationed in Afghanistan an occupying force. This is a country that's a stabilizing force.
No, I was talking about what I was thinking back in 2009, 2010 about the fact that we were in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Sure.
And spending billions and billions of dollars, and it went against, you know, all of my natural instincts. But again, 2011, 2012 taught me that sometimes there are Koreas in the world, and Afghanistan just may be our Korea. We may have to have troops there to stabilize for quite some time.
Trump was very honest about the nature of the threat posed by Pakistan, doing the double dealing there. He didn't talk about Iran, and he didn't talk about Russia. Russia's investing very heavily in Afghanistan, economic and military assistance, and it's aiding the Taliban.
Yeah.
The generals say that this is an insurgency, support for an insurgency. They say it's supporting the Taliban against ISIS. But we have a great game in Afghanistan that we are only just beginning to acknowledge that we're playing. It's time to be honest about that.
Yeah, it's time to be honest that, yeah, there's just not going to be a quick and easy war. You know, obviously, Steve Bannon is back running Breitbart, and this morning Breitbart is heaping criticism on the president and really going after General McMaster. They've had a nasty smear campaign against McMaster for some time. Talking about the McMaster wing, Trump reverses course, America first base unhappy with flip-flop. I wonder if they picked up the phone last night and called everybody in the base to know that. I don't think they really did. I think that's like one person unhappy. And also McMaster's voice, is Trump's Afghanistan policy different from Obama's? And so on, so forth. Does that resonate outside of Breitbart readership? You
really have to admire the gall of somebody who is content to say that their opinions represent the base.
Yes.
That's a lot of hubris.
When they're really not Republicans, when they're really not conservatives, well, I'll just say that again, they're just not conservatives.
No, some of them would be very honest about saying they're not conservatives. Yeah. Conservatism hasn't conserved very much at all. It was interesting the way there were so many rhetorical flourishes in that speech directed at the base. We're not nation building anymore.
Right.
You know, we're not talking about our troop levels. That's all nonsense. There's 4,000 troops that we know are going to be going. They've announced that level. They're saying we're going to support deals that benefit us. Well, we benefit from stability, and that means building a nation that can take more than 50% of the country and control it and can reduce some of the corruption that's crippling our efforts there. That's nation building. This is what we're doing. Whether we call it that or not is fine with me. Call it whatever you want, but that's what we're doing.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.